So far in Mark's account, we've seen Jesus undermine the whole basis of his trial by saying that he's the judge. Let's keep going with this trial to see what we can learn about the verdict and about the sentence. First of all, the verdict. Whenever Jesus tells the high priest that he's the divine judge, all hell breaks loose in that court. Look at verse 63. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, Prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. In a moment, the whole court deteriorates. It descends into a riot. It's not a trial anymore. The judges and jurors, they spit on Jesus, they beat him. The charge has been blasphemy, and the verdict's passed. Guilty. It's ironic, hugely ironic. The only perfect man who ever lived pronounced guilty by men whose guilt is every bit as great as his innocence. We've thought about the judge. We've thought briefly about the verdict. Let's think finally for a moment about the sentence. The court of the Sanhedrin has sentenced Jesus to death, but actually they don't have the power to enact the sentence. They have limited powers, and any capital case would need to be confirmed by the Roman procurator. So as soon as they're able, the Sanhedrin take Jesus to Pilate to put Jesus to death. Mark tells us about it in chapter 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. You have said so, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. It's like a second trial. The religious leaders are there, they're accusing him of the same sort of stuff all over again, and Jesus doesn't answer their charges. Pilate's astounded. The other gospel writers tell us that Pilate didn't really fancy this case with Jesus. He tried to squirm out of it. But then Pilate remembers that he has another card to play. You see, there's a time-honored custom where you release a prisoner at the time of a national celebration. It's Passover, so why not release a prisoner? Let's read on, verse 6. Now it was the custom at the time of the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing that it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. Pilate's trying to find a way out. He knows that the religious leaders are only accusing Jesus out of envy, but that they don't have any real case against him. Surely the crowd will opt to have Jesus set free. But Mark tells us, verse 11, that the chief priests stirred up the crowd to get Pilate to release Barabbas instead. Barabbas is a guilty man, one who's been convicted of murder, and Jesus is innocent, one who's only ever lived a life of love. What's Pilate to do? He caves in and he asks the crowd about Jesus. What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, Crucify him! Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed over to them to be crucified. Two men facing the death penalty. Barabbas, guilty as sin, but set free. Jesus, innocent of sin, but condemned to die. For weeks now, we've noticed a surprising theme running through these last days of Jesus' life. Despite appearances, Jesus is totally in control. When he was in the garden, he chose to take the cup of God's wrath. When he faced his arrest, he chose to go under the sword of God's justice. Now in this passage, he's chosen to submit to these couple of rigged trials. When we read this passage about Jesus and Barabbas, though, it's tempting to think that suddenly something terrible's happened. It all went wrong when the people chose Barabbas. No. It's no mistake that the people chose Barabbas. This is exactly what Jesus intended. Actually, if Pilate had asked Jesus the same question that he asked the crowd that day, which of these two men do you want me to release? The outcome would have been exactly the same. Jesus would have chosen Barabbas too. You see, friends, this is why Jesus came. He came to die so that Barabbas could live. He came to die so that I can live. He came to die so that you can live. Jesus came to die in our place. Let me offer you a picture that might give you a fresh way of understanding this aspect of Jesus' death. When I was a wee boy, I used to light fires, and sometimes I'd do it with a magnifying glass on a summer's day. I'd arrange a pile of dry leaves or dry grass, and then I'd use the glass to focus the sun's rays down onto a tiny point. The sheer intensity of the concentrated light at that very small point would then begin to heat the leaves and the grass until they finally burnt into flame. That's what happened when Jesus died on the cross at Calvary. All the sin and rebellion of humanity, in all times and in all places, was concentrated in that moment down to that one point, onto Jesus. In that moment, he took the sins of the world, all of them. And in that moment, God's judgment bore down on him. And that's why he came. He came to serve a death sentence in our place. I don't know whether this has ever occurred to you, but you and I have a lot in common with Barabbas. We stand before God, the judge of all the earth, and the verdict's clear. We're guilty. The sentence has been passed. We too deserve death. Beside us stands Jesus, the one who's every bit as innocent as we are guilty. And he asks his Father, when the Father asks him, whom shall I release? This guilty rebel or my only perfect Son? The Son replies, release him. Let him go free. Release her. I want to see her live. I wonder, friends, have we ever really grasped this? In Jesus, God died in your place. We have a choice to face, each one of us, and that choice is whether we face God's judgment and wrath on our own, or whether we accept that Jesus has taken it for us. It's your choice. What are you going to choose?